So today I will talk about the general method of what is called comparative statics. And then I'll talk about 2 or 3 applications of the very simple market clearing model that we developed. Okay. So when we draw a picture, right, we plot quantity demanded against the price of the good itself. And in a weird convention, which has become commonplace in economics, although price is the independent variable and quantity is the dependent variable, we kind of flip the usual convention and take price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. And that's how demand curves are drawn. So if we draw a demand curve, what is that representing exactly? Well, the underlying function, quantity demanded, is some function of the price of the good, of course, but there are plenty of other possible arguments to that function. For example, prices of other goods and income of consumers. Okay. So when we draw a particular demand curve like this, what we are saying is that implicitly we are holding the other prices, incomes, and every other factor, every other argument of the demand function, we are holding them fixed at certain levels. Okay. And fixing those other things, we are allowing the price of the good to vary, and we are plotting how quantity demanded changes as we do that. So at various prices, at P1, quantity demanded is Q1. At P2, quantity demanded is Q2, according to this graph. Now, what if the other factors that we held constant in the background, what if one of them changes? Okay, so for example, the consumer's income goes up, let's say, and let's say this is a normal good, it has a positive income elasticity. So how can that change be represented on this graph is the question. We have to shift the curve, right? Essentially, then what happens is that at every price of the good itself, let's say bread, whatever people were buying before, now they're going to buy more because they're richer, and this is a normal good with positive income elasticity. So the way to represent a change in any of the other factors is to shift the demand curve itself in an appropriate way. Okay, so the effect of changes in the price of the good is captured by movements along the demand curve, by moving from point A to point B, for example, when the price drops from P1 to P2. But changes in other factors like income are captured by shifting the curve itself. Okay, so this is something if you have taken economics, you are at the undergraduate level, you should be well familiar with, right? This sort of diagrammatic technique of using demand supply analysis. Now, one of the possible factors that I haven't listed here, but let's throw that in, is something like a taste parameter. Okay, so for example, the demand for eggs, let's say, suddenly there's a medical report which says that, eggs may have salmonella or some sort of potential disease, and that changes consumer behavior, right? For the same set of prices and incomes, people may be consuming less eggs because they're worried about catching the disease. So that will be captured by shifting the demand curve to the left. Alternatively, there could be medical reports which says, eggs are good for you, or, maybe it has some benefits which were not known before, and that will shift the demand curve to the right. So one compact way of representing that is to introduce a so-called taste parameter into the demand function, and then talk about what happens when that taste parameter changes. Okay, so let's think of alpha as such a taste parameter. And let's say higher values of alpha mean consumers have developed a more affinity for the good, right? They're more favorably disposed towards the good. Maybe they've got some positive news about the benefits of consuming that good. So one of the questions would be that, if the demand for something receives a positive taste shock like that, then what is the effect on market equilibrium outcomes, right? What is the impact on prices? What is the impact on the volume of trade? Now, if we fall back on our diagrammatic analysis that is sort of easy to track. We have our downward sloping demand curve, and we have our positively sloped supply curve. So this is our initial equilibrium price and quantity. And if there's a positive demand shock, let's say this is, let's say the crude oil market for the world, positive demand shock could come from, maybe because of economic growth. Some developing countries are having their GDPs growing, so they're putting more demand on oil consumption. And so that can be represented by drawing a new demand curve, which is further to the right, okay? And the picture immediately tells us that the result of this sort of a demand shock will be higher prices in equilibrium and more quantity. So sort of in introductory economics courses, this is how we talk about demand, supply, and so on. And this kind of exercise is what is called a comparative static exercise. Now, to be very clear about what a comparative static exercise means, let me be explicit about two kinds of variables that you find in an economic model. One kind of variable is called an endogenous variable. And another kind of variable is called an exogenous variable. Alternatively, the second kind of variable can be called a parameter of the model. What's the difference between the two kinds of variables? Endogenous variables are variables who take a value which is determined within the model. It is not given from outside. Whereas exogenous variables are variables which are given from outside the model. The model itself doesn't tell us how those values come about. In our consumer maximization problem, can you tell me what the endogenous variables are and what the exogenous variables are?
Sir, quantities chosen by the consumer are endogenous. Prices are given by the market only.
Right. So the consumer chooses the quantity. Those are the endogenous variables in the consumer choice problem. What are the exogenous variables? It's prices, income, taste parameter, alpha. The consumer does not choose prices or income. The consumer faces some price, some income from market conditions. And under those circumstances, the consumer chooses Q&M. So that's the sense of these two terms, right? Endogenous versus exogenous variables or parameters. Now, of course, what is an endogenous variable, what's an exogenous variable will depend very much on which model, which framework we're talking about. So if we move from the consumer choice problem to the market model, so in that model, in the market model, what are the endogenous variables? Price and quantity are endogenous in that it was exogenous in the consumer's choice problem, but it's endogenous in the market equilibrium model. But there are other parameters or exogenous variables too, like what? You can think of incomes, you can think of tastes of the consumers, you can think of costs of the firms, right? If cost conditions change and cost functions change, then the market equilibrium will change. So any of those things which are held fixed in the background, if they change, then of course the supply curve will move around. If incomes, tastes, etc. change, then the demand curve will move around. So those are parameters. Now, what are comparative statics exercises? Comparative statics exercises basically say that when an exogenous variable or parameter changes, how do the endogenous variables react to that? For a given set of parameters, we can solve for the values of the endogenous variables from the model. For example, in the consumer's case, the various quantity choices can be solved. Now, when one of the exogenous factors change, that solution moves around, right? We have a new solution. And comparative statics exercises are essentially this sort of exercise. How do the endogenous variables change when some parameter shifts? So in the consumer's problem, when we change market prices or incomes, that is a comparative statics exercise. In the market model, if we change cost conditions of firms, that affects the supply curve. If we change consumer tastes, that affect the demand curve. Those are all comparative statics exercises, right? So this little diagrammatic analysis, which I just did, is an example of a comparative statics exercise in a market model, okay? And the conclusion of the exercise through the diagram is that positive taste shocks will lead to higher prices and quantities. This sort of thing, what we are going to do is develop a mathematical technique, translate this sort of diagrammatic analysis into mathematical language. Why do we need to do that? Because if you're talking of a single good market, one good, price and quantity, it's a very simple setup, okay? So we can think about various things by drawing pictures. If you have a more complex model, okay, for example, a general equilibrium model of many markets clearing simultaneously, as you will do in the second part of the course, when the model gets complicated, there are more variables, it becomes more multidimensional. There, sort of keeping track of things by drawing pictures does not suffice anymore. And so we need more general mathematical techniques. So that's why even for the simple model, I'm going to show you and hopefully plant in your head how the math works for exactly this sort of comparative static exercise. Let me say one thing, which is that, when we are studying micro, there are sort of three languages almost in which we can speak. We can draw pictures, and this is you're familiar with often in your undergraduate curriculum. We can do the math, and we can talk intuitively in plain English, talk about the broad common sense of the analysis, right? And what I want you to develop is a skill to transition between these three. The same idea, the same logic can be conveyed often in pictures, in math, as well as in plain language. And you should become adept at this sort of exercise. At the heart of the market model is a simple single equation, right? Demand equals supply. So that's what I've written down. P star is the market clearing price, that price at which this equality holds. And I'm carrying two parameters, one inside the demand function, alpha is the taste parameter, beta is, let's say, a cost parameter. So we can think of the following interpretation, that if alpha rises, then for every price, there's more demand. So the demand curve shifts to the right. And similarly, for the supply curve, if beta rises, we can think of that as a cost reduction. So at every price, supply shifts to the right. First, let's do comparative statics with respect to changes in alpha. So for a given alpha beta, we have this equality, and now alpha has increased slightly. How does P star move and the corresponding Q star? We'll use that same trick that I've been talking about, right? Which is that if I define this price to be the market clearing price, then this becomes an identity. And again, there's a little slip here. This should have been written as an identity. So think of this as an identity. So if I think of this as an identity, I can differentiate both sides with respect to alpha and equate them. So let's do that. Let's differentiate the left-hand side. And if we do that, we'll have two terms. Notice that alpha directly affects the function. So there's a partial derivative with respect to alpha, which will be one of our terms on the left-hand side. Q sub alpha or del Q del alpha. But alpha also affects P star, the equilibrium market price. So P star, you can think of it as a function of alpha and beta. The taste parameter and the cost parameter affects P star, the market price. So P star is a function of those two things. So therefore, we have to apply chain rule. Another effect of changing alpha is through its effect on P star itself. How do we capture that in calculus terms? Well, there will be a partial derivative with respect to the price argument, and then dP star d alpha. Okay, so intuitively, what do these two terms capture? The first term captures the direct effect of the taste shock. At every price, consumers want to buy more because they have received a positive taste shock. The second component captures the indirect effect of the taste shock on consumers, right? Because of the taste shock, the price will change, and that price change has a further impact on how much consumers want to buy. So the first term is the direct effect, the second term is the indirect effect. Now, if we move over to the right-hand side, we are differentiating with respect to alpha. Alpha does not directly figure, explicitly figure inside the function, but that doesn't mean that the function isn't affected. That just means that the effect of alpha on supply is only indirect. There's no direct effect, but there's an indirect effect. And that is captured by differentiating and using chain rule. So del X del P, and then dP d alpha. And now if you notice, what we have is a simple linear equation in one unknown, which is the value of this derivative, dP d alpha. So we can solve for the value of this derivative, and the solution will involve all these partial derivatives of the two demand and supply functions, right? And this is our solution. It's easy to check. Now, can we put a sign? Can we say whether this is positive or negative? Well, Q alpha we have defined to be a positive number. And we have defined alpha to be a helpful factor. So Q alpha is positive. What is the sign of the denominator? The denominator has to be positive because of the law of demand and supply, right? XP is the slope of the supply curve. That's positive. We have derived that. QP is the slope of the demand curve, which is negative. So minus in front of that makes it positive. So the numerator is positive. The denominator is positive. So we can conclude from this analysis that dP star d alpha is positive. So if there's a positive taste shock, that will inevitably lead to higher market prices. So the same thing that we saw with the diagram by shifting the demand curve, we are seeing here with the mathematics. Yes, so we have derived an expression for dP star d alpha. Now, what is dQ d alpha, dQ star d alpha? Well, it's basically the derivative of any of these functions, or basically it is any of these terms. So we can look at the right-hand side. I'll substitute the dP star d alpha that we solved for. I'll put it in here, and that multiplied by XP tells us what is the effect on equilibrium supply and equilibrium demand, the equilibrium values of those things. And that's also positive because XP multiplied by dP star d alpha, XP is a positive thing. This is positive, we already derived. So the effect is positive. If we are interested in the effect on cost parameters, let's say, change in beta, and again, let's think of beta as, let's think of X beta, X del beta as strictly positive. That should be thought of as falling costs, not rising costs, really. There are little annoying typos here and there. They should be falling costs, right? So if you think of increase in beta as falling costs, then that's a positive supply shift, right? Supply curve shifts to the right. So we can do exactly using the same method. We can derive expressions for dP star d beta and dQ star d beta, right? So I won't repeat it, go through it step by step, but when you can check yourself, and you should do it at home. When you do it, you get these expressions. And here, this is dP star d beta. X beta we have taken to be positive, right? What is the effect of falling costs and supply shifts to the right? Here, the numerator is negative. This is the slope of the demand function, which is negative, and this is minus of a positive term. So a rise in beta, falling costs will lead to falling prices. So conversely, a fall in beta, which is rising costs, will lead to higher prices. Let's take an example, the world crude market and the movement of crude prices. As you know, there have been dramatic movements in crude prices over the last several years. If you look at the data, there was a period over which they were falling substantially and then they were rising. And, you know, if you kind of look at the discussion in the media, often there's this speculation that if crude prices are going up, what is driving it? And often there are sort of these rival narratives. One narrative is that, you know, maybe in emerging economies like China or India or other countries in South Asia, which have fast economic growth. Fast growth is creating, a positive demand shock, and that's what driving up global crude prices. An alternative explanation is that, there's a negative supply shock. Something is shifting the supply curve to the left, maybe rising costs, regulation, carbon taxes, what have you. Okay. Now, if we have to distinguish between these explanations, if you observe that crude prices are going up, and some people are saying, oh, it's a demand shock, some people are saying it's a supply shock, how do we know which is driving it, which is the more important factor? Let's first look at it in terms of pictures. Here I drew the picture of a demand shock, right? A demand shock raises prices and quantities. If I drew the picture for supply shocks, these are original demand supply curves. And a supply shock that will drive up prices will be a negative supply shock. Supply curve shifts to the left. That drives up prices. Okay, from the original equilibrium. But what's the difference from the other picture, the demand shock picture? Here, prices rise, but quantities fall. Okay, so we can tell from the data which kind of shock is the more important one, or the more relevant driving force. We have to look at data on both prices and volumes. So our analysis tells us that, what's the way to sort of systematically think about this and distinguish between rival explanations based on observed data. Now, we did this by drawing the pictures. The pictures tell us that supply and demand shocks will move quantities in different directions, even though both raise prices. The same could have been done with the maths. The mathematical expressions that we derived give us the same answer. Was there a question?
Sir?
Yes.
Shouldn't X beta be less than 0? Because if B rises, that is the cost rises, X will fall down.
That's a matter of interpretation or definition, right? I can think of higher values of beta representing lower costs, and that would mean X beta is to be signed as positive. But I may also want to think of higher values of beta representing higher costs, in which case X beta has to be taken as negative, right?
Okay, sir.
Yes, Rishi.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, in our analysis of favorable taste changes, can we just say that the positive impact of taste outweighs the negative indirect effect of price on the demand?
Yes, that's a very good question. In the case of taste shocks, right? If you go to the picture, see what happens. This is the original equilibrium, right? P1, Q1. The taste shock arrives, so the demand curve shifts to the right. If the market price did not adjust, then consumer demand will increase by this amount. Yes. Now, of course, that will lead to an excess demand situation, right? Suppliers haven't received any favorable shock, so they are not at the original market equilibrium price. They are not willing to meet this extra demand, and that's why the market adjusts. It raises the prices. What the price rise does is that it does two things. It encourages suppliers to supply some more by making it lucrative, by increasing the price. At the same time, it discourages consumers from consuming so much extra. So it chokes off some of the demand and it entices some extra supply. By how much? You can see that in the picture, right? Once the market settles down to a new equilibrium, this original excess demand, this part is the part of the extra demand that has been choked off by a price increase. And this Other part is the part of the excess demand that has been met by encouraging suppliers to supply some more. Okay. So yes, the price has the effect of partially reversing this sudden gung-ho enthusiasm which consumers developed, right? Now, what this tells us is that this choking off of demand is going to be less than 100%. Blood ivory. There's a massive illegal black market for animal parts, ivory from elephants, the rhinoceros from the horns of the rhinoceros. Unfortunately, sort of a thriving market to a great extent in China, but also in other countries. And so much of the ivory trade in the black market comes from poachers killing elephants. So this is a picture, and taking their tusks and selling them on the black market. This sort of thing is illegal, of course. And governments which have elephants, countries in Africa, our country, and some others, mainly Africa, because African elephants have these huge tusks. They try to put a stop on this. So sometimes they catch poachers and they seize these elephant tusks from them. And various countries like Kenya or Tanzania, over time, they have built up a sort of big inventory of seized elephant tusks. Here's a picture. There's a warehouse where these tusks are there. So what do those governments do with these things? In the black market, they're very, very valuable. They can fetch billions of dollars. Well, there are two options. One is to sort of release them on the market and allow various kinds of handicrafts to be built from them. And the other option is this: either to keep it stored away, never allow it to come out on the market, never, or destroy them, burn them. A little more of facts and factoids. The 1980s was a terrible decade for the elephant population in Africa, right? Over 10 years, the elephant population fell by more than 50%, as you can see, 1.3 million down to 600,000 estimate. At the time, there was $1 billion of ivory trade world over. That was the estimate. And 80% or thereabouts was coming from freshly killed elephants. So a large part of the trade that was happening in the black market was coming from fresh kills. So this organization, international organization called CITES, was formed, and they banned and regulate these things. And various countries signed a pact that will not allow our elephants to be killed and poached. Now, from time to time, as I said, as countries build up these inventories from seized ivory, they sometimes applied to this international body to allow them to sort of, as a one-time thing, sell off their seized stockpiles, right? So here's an example: 1997, CITES, after a review, allowed Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Botswana to sell 49 tons to Japan. But in 2010, we have a contrast. Zambia and Tanzania applied for the same thing, but they were turned down. So here's a debate among environmentalists, among animal lovers, among governments, public officials, that in these situations, when a poor, struggling African country has built up this kind of stockpile, which can be extremely valuable, what is the right way forward? Should they be allowed to sell it off for revenues? Because these elephants are dead already. Going by some sort of sunk cost principle, is the right approach to allow them to sell or not? So, as economists, what should we say? A lot of environmentalists take a very firm negative stand, right? So this is a poster, which is, you can see the illusion, right? These are elephant tusks, but they are shaped like demand and supply curves, saying that no, absolutely never should these things come onto any kind of market. But what should our position be?
Sir, as an economist, we should think about like selling them only if the elephants are actually dead now. and instead of destroying it, we can, if it is done in a legal market, not in black markets, that is not going to help economy in any way. But from a social point of view, it's not right to do this thing.
Okay.
But doesn't selling them set a bad precedent? Like we're basically doing what we were doing earlier.
Good morning, sir. Sir, I would say that the trade should be allowed, but there must be a provision that the amount that the governments get, like say 20% or 40% of that, should be used to prevent like more poaching of these animals, and so that the people who are against it are also satisfied to an extent that yes, the revenue that the government is getting are being used in a good manner to protect the elephants or the poaching.
Okay. So let me, good point. Let me say something. Any policy depends on objectives. Let's say the objective here is to save elephants, right? From that perspective, from a conservation perspective, what is the right thing to do? So let's all agree on that. So Anshu's point is that, these countries are poor, so some of the money from the sale can be used to hire forest guards, put more resources, give them better equipment, training. So invest the proceeds in better conservation effort. Okay, that's something to consider. Deepti?
So I feel means if we have an administration which is strong enough and that it can ensure that only the piles would be used, only the piles will be used for selling them, and no fresh elephant is killed for the ivory, then though we could implement the policy that we could allow them to sell off the already stocked pile. But if the administration is not strong enough in that country and there is a chances that the new elephants might be killed for that business, then though we should go for a strict no or something and better alternative.
Why would new elephants be killed? I mean, here, prima facie, we are talking of selling tusks of dead elephants.
Yes.
Right?
So it might be possible that they might kill new elephants for the tusk and they show that it was already available in the stock to start an illegal market and giving it a legal format.
So maybe what you're saying, not maybe, that seems to be pretty much what you're saying, which is that, it generates perhaps bad incentives for some of these governments.
Yes, sir.
That they could sort of be hand in glove with these poachers and from time to time, take the stuff which poachers have collected. And so instead of trying to fight poachers, they actually collude with poachers under the table. That's a possibility. That's a good point. Charul?
Sir, I don't think so that one should be selling off these stockpiles because, sir, if government do it once that this, let's say they just sell all the stockpiles, then people might frame this expectation that no, if there's a stockpile, governments are going to sell it. And then these poacher organization, what they can do is that they can come up with ideas or come up with people who are ready to take the blame, go to jail, and then they could use the sales amount to get some compensation for themselves. So there's a loophole in this situation.
So you're worried about the possibility of collusion between governments and poachers. That's essentially.
Yes, sir. Kind of.
Yes, sir. Sir, according to me also, we should not allow them to sell these. Because, sir, if we are right now not allowing them to sell these, it will create a one-time sunk cost. But if once we allow them, it will kind of encourage it. And this will be like recurring cost. So losing elephant is also kind of economic loss to the country.
No, we are taking that as given that we want to save the elephants, right? We are not debating that point. Now,
yes, sir, but it is going to again create the market for the ivory.
Yes. No, that's a possibility, but we want to be a little more specific about what possible channel through which that will happen, right? Let's say these governments remain honest. Okay, if somehow we can convince ourselves that they won't secretly collude with the poachers, then there's nothing in it for poachers, right? You're just allowing the governments to sell the ivory. You're not providing any benefits to poachers themselves, isn't it? So once again, one of the arguments you can place on the table is that this possibility of collusion, which has been mentioned, right? but is there some other reason why there could be a negative effect of these sales? The collusion point we have sort of understood, yeah. Sambhav?
Sir, I think so when we allow these countries to sell ivory, so in the market, the price of ivory is going to reduce, which is further going to discourage poachers in future. So in future, supply will reduce because of that. So from conservation point of view, also this could be good. And also since government will get revenue, so they can use it for the welfare of people, even for the welfare of elephants.
Okay, so that's an important, that's an important point. Let me put some other questions, comments on hold for a moment. Let me discuss this point, okay? I'll skip this slide and come back to it. There's a strong economic argument for allowing the sale. Let me say at the outset, I'm not making a categorical statement that the selling is the right thing to do. I'm saying that there's one set of factors, the sort of market demand supply factors. If you just focus on those, then there is a positive aspect of allowing the sale. So let me explain. This is what Sambhav was talking about. I'm elaborating on that. Okay, so this is, let's say, the initial demand supply situation in the ivory black market, or the overall market for ivory, right? Legal, illegal, whatever segments there are. P0, Q0 are the equilibrium prices and quantities. Now, if Kenya is allowed to put their stockpile on this market, what does that mean? That means a supply shock, essentially, right? At every price, there's more supply forthcoming. So if we draw the picture, X is Kenya's stockpile, so the whole supply curve will shift, have a parallel shift to the right by the amount X. So where is the new equilibrium? The new equilibrium is this: price P1, quantity Q1. Of course, if you dump more stuff on the market, it'll bring down the price, as positive supply shocks do. And the overall quantity increases. Overall quantity increases, does that mean more elephants are going to be killed? Well, no, because now in the new situation, part of the supply is not coming from fresh kills, it's coming from the inventory which Kenya built up in the past from elephants which were killed in the past. Namely, X quantity is old stock, and the remaining amount of this Q1 is fresh kills. So let's subtract X from Q1. Okay, that's what we have to do to see how many elephants will be killed in the new equilibrium. And so if you subtract X, you go down to Q2, which is less than the initial Q0. The idea is very simple. If these stockpiles are dumped on the market, it'll drive down the market price. And so poachers will make less profits. And so they'll hunt and kill fewer elephants. That's the benefit through the market forces.
No, but what if this happens again? Like, what if there is again a stockpile? Isn't this, like the other people said, doesn't this also give an incentive for them to continue poaching eventually, maybe after the controversy dies down?
Yes. So the thing is, this is one of the considerations. This is one of the things that will go up if you allow these sales, right? Now, of course, there are others. So I have, and some of that came up in the discussion. So let me go to this slide. You can bring other arguments to the issue, and some of you have done so. You can reinforce the point that we made, and as some of you mentioned, there's also potential benefit from the revenues from the sales proceeds. These countries can shore up their forest departments, or they can invest in local communities. Right. Often what happens is that the poachers sort of collaborate with local populations. And if local populations don't have good livelihoods or jobs, then it's in their incentive to collaborate with poachers. But if you create things like tourism industries, then their incentives are exactly the opposite. They have an interest in conservation. So they'll collaborate with conservation authorities rather than poachers. So those are additional points in favor of allowing stockpiles. But there are other factors also, which again came up in the discussion, that, for example, let me take this last point. One of the ways in which we want to discourage these sorts of questionable commodities is by creating some sort of consumer movement, naming and shaming, for example. Right? There was a point, if you look at old Hollywood movies, stars would wear animal fur. And these days, it's an extreme taboo. You can't be seen wearing fur in public. Part of what is going on, which is not captured in our simple demand supply analysis, is that there is an attempt for consumers to be ethical consumers. And that sort of moves around the demand curve, right? If we make an ethical push or consumer movement, that'll shift the demand curve to the left. And if we do the opposite, it'll move it to the right. And one could argue that by this sort of allowing these sales periodically, we are kind of making it more murky as far as consumers are concerned, right? They are getting sort of weaker signals. It's one thing to say that you should never wear fur or have ivory products, period. It's another thing to say that, it's fine on Wednesdays, but not on Thursdays, right? That makes the message weaker. The other thing is enforcement, right? If you have a complete clean ban, and anybody caught with ivory, selling ivory is doing something illegal, so it's easy to prosecute. Whereas if ivory is, under some circumstances, it's allowed, in other circumstances, depending on source, then enforcement becomes difficult. However, the point that is captured in this demand supply figures is not the final word, but it is one of the forces that any sort of evaluation of this problem has to take into account, right? I think we can agree on that. Often theory doesn't give us the final answer. We have to make theory with data to assess what's going on. But theory helps us sort out our thinking, helps us identify potential forces before we go out and estimate them using data, right? So one of the things theory is telling us is that, among other things, there's one potential beneficial aspect of allowing these sales, which is making the product cheaper in the black market and less profitable for poachers.
So, sir, I was thinking by imposing high penalty, we can somehow reduce the trade. And another thing is by nudging them, or what you were telling few minutes that we can somehow shame them socially.
Yeah.
So this can be a solution, so that the expected utility of not going for an ivory trade is greater than going for an ivory trade.
Yeah. So I'm saying that the consumer try to influence consumer preferences is part of the story. Yeah, and when we think of that, there could be a potential downside to allowing these sales, is that it weakens the ethics among consumers. Aishwarya?
Sir, in my opinion, this should not be a market transaction. If the benefit from selling these is beneficial for Africa, there should be like a round table between countries where this transaction gets over in one instance, so that there is no market that is created.
Well, the thing is that, as these things go on over time, okay, one time you clear everything, and then
similar to like stockpiling of nuclear weapons as such. I mean, this is more like it could be a diplomatic transaction between countries in a round table rather than having a market for it.
Yes, but I mean, eventually, see, the thing is that, okay, you can create different market segments. You can say that, well, this ivory coming through legal channels will be sold in these earmarked markets. Now, the same consumers can go and buy from the official markets as well as from the unofficial black market, right? So the prices in the official market and the black market are not independent, they're linked. So if some of the consumers have gone and bought ivory from the official market, they are consumers who who otherwise would have gone to the black market, right? And so since some consumers get diverted to the official market, it will have an effect on the black market prices. Yes. One of the things in economics is that you have to take into account all plausible connections. Since it's the same product, even if you ring fence the official markets and they don't spill over into each other, they actually will, their prices will move together because it's the same product after all.
Yes, sir, I understand your point, but what I was insinuating is that we eliminate a market structure here and we make it a one-time transaction.
There are two separate issues, okay?
Okay.
One is that there are 2 points, maybe you're saying simultaneously, but whatever. The segmenting of the market is ultimately not going to prevent the price effect that we are talking about. That was the first response I gave. The other thing is that, you're saying, okay, let's get it done once and for all, right?
Yes.
Today, let's sit down and clear out all the stocks and just make a promise we'll never do this again. The problem is that this is an ongoing rolling problem, right? So even if all the stocks are clear out, probably poaching and killing of elephants won't be eliminated. So over time, stocks will build up again. So then 10 years from now, we'll again be in this situation and have to scratch our heads about what to do.
Yes, yes, I agree with what you said. Thank you so much for the clarity.